what was happening in the United States, especially as it concerned the relationship between blacks and whites. He was wrecked. And he was saying that God can't be pleased with this, and he was willing to place everything on the line. And in this particular speech, you might think that the promised land was the kingdom of heaven. But it wasn't. What he saw by faith were blacks and whites living together in harmony as equals. That was the promised land. That's why he said, I may not get there with you. He saw something in the future. He was burdened by it. He was taken by it. There was another man in history that had a great impact on Martin Luther King and on many others as well. And his name was Gandhi. He believed in nonviolence. He believed in resistance of the government when that was the right thing to do. He once marched 240 miles to protest the tax on the salt and to protest the fact that no one could make or sell salt except the British in India. None of the 300 million Indians could do that. He walked 240 miles, building up support as he went. And he had a tremendous impact on society because he said, we will not fight. This will be just resistance. His passion was for his people. His passion was for equality. His passion was to come out from underneath English rule, and it was done without violence. He saw something. He was burdened by it. And he lived it. You know, he adopted the Indian dress. And he adopted the rule of poverty. He lived like everyone else lived. Even though he could have traveled first class after he became famous, he still traveled third class. Because that was important to the fight in the sense that until everyone can travel in the same coach, that he would not travel. Unless everyone could dress equally, he would dress as a peasant. He went to Buckingham Palace. He was invited for tea. And he went dressed like this. The reporters got hold of it. And at the end, they said, weren't you embarrassed to go before the king, to go before royalty, dressed like this? His response was, the king wore enough clothes for both of us. I like that. He wasn't caught by the pressures because the burden was so great. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord, and I pray that each one of us, that we might get a divine burden, that's what matters to us. Something greater than ourselves. That by God's grace and God's strength, we will make a difference in this society. This is what was happening to Nehemiah. He says, I can't stand it anymore. And what did God do? He used the guy with a burden to make a difference. He didn't use somebody that didn't have the burden. He used the guy that he had placed the burden upon. An unlikely guy. And so I want to tell you, if you have a burden today, this is God speaking to you. So the first question is, what breaks your heart? And I pray that our hearts are broken on something in this world today, because there's a lot to be broken about. What breaks your heart? Maybe it's all the kids that die every single year because of malnourishment, when in fact we could feed them. We could feed them. There is no reason for anyone to die because of malnourishment and because of the diseases associated with that. We have enough resources to feed everyone on this planet. But the allocation is warped. And we're not willing to give it up. That may be your burden. It may be all those kids that are born with disease and destruction already, even though they hadn't done anything wrong in their own lives. They are suffering because of the mistakes and misdeeds of others. Maybe it's all those kids that are born addicted to drugs, cocaine babies, because of what their parents were involved in. Or maybe your burden, the thing that breaks your heart, are single moms or single dads that are struggling to make ends meet, and oftentimes they will take on 2 jobs just to make ends meet. And I tell you, what a travesty in Canada. What a travesty in Canada that any one of our children should live in poverty. Because it doesn't need to happen. We should be upset. We should have a divine burden for some of these things. The second question would be, what makes you angry? I'd like you to turn to Exodus chapter 2, if you would. Exodus chapter 2 and verse 11. And I'm not going to suggest for a moment that as we read this, that if you get angry, you should do this. I'm only suggesting that he had a burden. Okay? Exodus chapter 2 and verse 11 says, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. What makes you angry? For Moses here, it was the mistreatment of his people. He had come to realize who he was, and he got a burden for his people. So much so that when someone was mistreating him, he actually went out and killed the Egyptian. Who was it then that God would lead in a number of years? Who was it that God would lead to be his instrument to free God's people? Moses. Why? Because he was the one with the burden. He was the one that was passionate. He was the one that got angry because of the injustice and the maltreatment. Maybe your issue is that you see elderly people in a nursing home, forgotten, left there to languish, and it makes you angry. Maybe you're one of those ones that you look at drug dealers or what's going on in the downtown sector and you think something has to be done here because neighborhood shouldn't be taken over because of this sort of thing happening in our society. Or maybe for you, you get angry when you see women beaten up, when you see them battered, when you see them in distress, possibly for lifestyle choices that they have made, but nonetheless, it makes you angry and you cry out, something needs to happen. Something needs to be done. You know, Mother Teresa said this, when I see waste, I feel anger on the inside. I don't approve of my anger, but it is something I can't help when I see the people in Ethiopia. So for some, it's not just a question of having a burden. For some, it could be, and this could be the thing about righteous anger. Being righteously angry about something that is happening with others. Do we have that going on in our lives? And I want you to know that I'm not talking about pet peeves. You know, like, my husband left the seat up. Things that are just peeves of ours. I'm talking about anger. Righteous anger. Because of what's happening. The third question we need to ask in order to define what our burden is,